can cause a change in the money market as well. So I'm going to give you an example. Let's say the marginal propensity to consume increases. So what happens then? Well, that means all the consumers are more likely to buy more goods. So consumption aspect of GDP increases because GDP comprises of consumption, investment, net export, government spending. So when the consumption increases, the aggregate GDP also increases. So what is that to demand? Well, as I said earlier, that demand is GDP. It is positively associated with GDP. If it increases, demand increases. And we can make sense of that too, because this causes a shift in demand. I mean, that's very self-explanatory. If marginal propensity to consume increases, people are more likely to go out and loan money because they want to consume more things. And they are not likely to have as much money because the government did not shift anything there. Therefore, they're going to have to go to banks and loan out money. Therefore, demand for loanable funds increases. So what is the shift in the demand curve to the right do? Well, it increases the interest rate, as we see right here, which I'm going to call IR prime. That AP testing usually accepts that. It increases right here. Now, what is this to this market? Because both of these market are in this. Both of these smaller markets are in a bigger market of the United States. So the new equilibrium interest rate is going to cause a change here as well. So what changes? Supply or demand? Well, let's talk about demand for money. So if people are consuming more, they need money to buy it. So if they want more money, and the demand for money would have increased because people need money to buy things. So the demand increases to the right. So I'm sorry I didn't label it. That's DLF prime, and that's demand for money prime. And that's the new interest rate. Now, as you notice here, the quantity of loanable funds also increases in here, and that was the original equilibrium point. Now, this is the new equilibrium point, because as there's a higher interest rate, there is a lower opportunity cost. Therefore, people are more likely to invest, because if it were lower, that it would have a higher opportunity cost to invest. You don't want higher opportunity costs, you want lower opportunity costs. So both of this causes a shift. Okay, so I copied the same graph as above, the loanable funds market and the money market. So I'm just going to give you another scenario. So what happens if the government runs a deficit? Okay, so if the government runs a deficit, that means that the government spending exceeds the amount of revenue that it receives in taxes. So the deficit must be financed through sales of U.S. Treasury bonds, notes, and bills. So therefore, the demand for loanable funds increases. So I'm going to label that as a shift in demand. Demand of loanable funds prime, which is a good idea for the AP test to do. So what does this do to the equilibrium point? Well, the real interest rate increases. I'm sorry I did not do one of the first steps. That's one of the first steps that you must do is draw through it. So that's the original IRE, and that's the second IRE prime. Alright, so that causes a shift. So what happens to the money market if the demand for loanable funds were to increase? There are in fact two things that can happen. The Mankey will tell you in his book that it decreases the supply of loanable funds. It's going to cause a decrease. However, the AP test accepts two answers. One, a decrease in the supply of money, or an increase in the demand. And I actually like the increase in demand because it's just very similar. Increase in demand, increase in demand. It's just very easy. But what you have to try to do is that since the interest rate has increased, what causes the interest rate to increase here as well? Because we know that this is part of the same market. An increase in demand for money, which is going to increase the interest rate. And what could possibly also happen is that between the supply for money could decrease. This could also happen. That's demand for money prime, and that's supply for money prime. So any one of this is acceptable for the AP test, but for Mankey, he says it's only demand. So in addition to knowing the graph of loanable funds and money supply and money market, you should also know about the connection between loanable funds and banking system. So right here, I have a bank. I'm going to call it Bank A. And I save $100. So I'm going to put in $100 into the bank. So what are reserves within a bank? Well, the federal government sets a certain criteria on how much money the bank has to hold. It cannot loan out that percent of money. So let's say the reserve ratio is 10%. So the bank has to keep 10% of how much money that people have saved in the bank in the reserve. That's a security blanket. And the excess reserve is how much the bank, it's the 90% that they can loan out. And so with the $100 they invested, how much money would the bank have to keep in its reserve? Well, 10% of $100 is $10. So a bank has to keep $10 in its bank. And what's the excess reserve? Well, we can simply just subtract $10 from the $100 right here. So that would be $90. So the bank can loan out $90. So let's say Mr. Romoff comes in and he wants to borrow money from the bank. He wants to borrow $110. He wants to borrow $110. So what happens? Can he make that transaction? The answer is yes, he can. The bank will give him $110 even though the bank only has $100. So where does the other $10 come from? Well, they do need the reserve ratio as well. How do they satisfy the reserve ratio even after they pay it? Well, what Bank A does is it calls up Bank B. So I'm going to call this bank. This bank has money. I mean, this is the wonder of capitalism. There's no one bank that monopolizes anything. So the money from here comes to this bank. So all that Bank A has to do to Bank B is pay an interest rate. And what do we call the interest rate? It's called federal funds rate. Federal funds. Federal funds rate. That's the interest rate that Bank A has to pay to Bank B for allowing it to earn money. So Mr. Romoff can take that investment and buy a capital. So these are the major aspects of loanable funds, money market, and the banking system that you should know for the AP test. And I remember in the AP test they did ask a lot of questions on loanable funds and money supply, so you should be very adept at that. So good luck to you, and thanks for watching.